Thanks very much for turning out tonight. And those of you who were at the Mary Robinson talk, I didn't see it myself, but I think there's maybe a little bit of an overlap. So I'm going to spend the first little while in my talk. We'll get to Benatar, but I just want to put a little bit of context on what I'm going to say. And I don't want to claim to be an expert, so it's a bit unusual to be talking about somebody else's work rather than your own. But I felt that this was an appropriately interesting topic to pursue in this forum. Potentially controversial, but I think if we have a sort of a calm look at it and maybe even a slightly bemused look at it, then it could be productive. So I'm going to start with a few disclaimers. So firstly, as far as I can discern, Benatar is a high-quality moral and ethical philosopher. He's the head of a department, a philosophy department in Cape Town, University of Cape Town. I'm not a trained philosopher, so you might think it's a little bit presumptuous that without even talking to the man I'm going to present some of his arguments, but I feel that they are relevant to some of my own work, which is in the area of reproduction and evolutionary biology. And so when I see a book on a shelf that says that it's morally dubious for humans to reproduce, I feel it's a book I should read and try and understand. So what you'll be getting tonight will be my interpretation or understanding of Benatar, not Benatar. So I'd urge you to read the book yourselves. It's published by Oxford University Press. It's an absolutely beautifully written book. I think it's exquisitely written and argued. I'm not claiming that in the sort of deep philosophical parts of it that I'm competent to judge or follow the arguments myself. But I think the core part of his argument that relates to my work and that he founds all of his subsequent arguments on is something that we can probably look at tonight. I've also, I think it's a good day to put this up because Wikipedia was out of action today. So when you give a talk like this, you have to scout around for some sort of general background. So I've committed this major mortal sin of using Wikipedia to fill in some of the gaps in the introductory slides. So I hope nobody will hold that against me. And as I've just said, I don't speak for and I have never spoken to David Benatar. So again, I think what you're getting tonight will be my interpretation. So before I go into a little general introduction, I just want to throw up a preview of the core or major conclusions that Benatar arrives at. And this is really, if you like, the blurb of his book. So he says that it's always wrong to have children. And by that he means morally wrong. It would be better if pregnant women aborted fetuses in the earlier stages of pregnancy. He assigns, I guess, some rights to fetuses at later stages of pregnancy, but for early fetuses he feels that it would be correct to abort them. Ideally there should be no people in the world. It's a modest proposal, I guess. It would be better, all things being equal, if human extinction happened sooner rather than later, so let's get on with the job. And this doesn't just apply to humans, it applies to all sentient species. So that might include our ape relatives, and perhaps we could go down to mammals and even look at some of the birds. Anything that's really has a well enough developed brain that it's capable of suffering to any extent, and if you like, to realize that it's suffering. And that includes aliens if they're out there as well, in case they're listening tonight. And so after that preview, I think we all need cheering up at this stage, so I'll put up a smiley face. Now, as an evolutionary biologist, I can point to the glorious history of life on the planet, and so my immediate reaction would be the reaction of many people. First, seeing Benatar's arguments would be one of probably of revulsion, because 4 billion years of evolution has produced some pretty amazing species, and here we are sitting right on the edge, and this isn't to give ourselves a pat on the back necessarily. There are millions of other species sitting along this edge with us, which is the present, and they are as equally, evolved as we are. They may not be as complex, they may not have the same cultural capacity that we do, but they've all come like us from some little guy way down here about 3 billion years ago that we've very little evidence for. Now, one thing to point out here is that the vast majority of species on this little spiral are actually extinct. So extinction is a natural part of it's a part of the natural order. And I don't think any serious scientist would debate or state with any certainty that humans are going to be any different. So human extinction is, you know, you would really have to say that it's going to happen at some point, unless we're going to claim, as I guess we often do, that we're different to every other species on the planet. Now, how did we get to where we are today? And I think this slide has some relevance to Benatar's arguments. So we got here, the people may have different views on this, but my view is that we got here by Darwinian natural selection. And the two components of what's called Darwinian fitness, the package that allows us, an individual within a species to prosper and to reproduce and to contribute to the next generation, are viability and fecundity. So you have to be a good quality embryo, which usually means you've got good genes. You're born, you're quite fit, you can grow up and compete and survive all sorts of selection pressures from parasites and predators, etc. And so some of the core features then of any species is that they are interested in their self-preservation. So we all have an innate physiology and psychology that means that we want to survive. It's possibly not correct, except for humans, to say that we have an innate drive to reproduce. We have an innate drive to have sex with the opposite sex, perhaps, but you know, animals other than ourselves perhaps don't actually decide to have children. They decide to have to mate, to have sex. But nevertheless, that's a strong drive. And two books, very recent books, have recently pointed out or underlined the fact that within human psychology there seems to be an evolved optimism and also an evolved self-delusion. So we fool ourselves that things are better than they really are, and that's really perhaps an adaptation to keep us going, to keep us trying to survive, and to keep us trying to reproduce. And that's, if you like, a genetic or a Darwinian strategy. Now, some years ago, Richard Dawkins made an argument about universal Darwinism. So he said that the basic concept of a selfish gene or a selfish replicator will be found throughout the universe. So we will find universal Darwinism. So if we go to other planets eventually, to other solar systems, we can even speculate perhaps about other galaxies. If there is life, we would expect it to evolve under Darwinian natural selection. And so what that means is that alien physiology and indeed psychology might actually, you know, there are going to be differences and perhaps pretty amazing and interesting differences, but it should be in the same sort of, on the same pitch that we're on ourselves. So it may be that if we did meet aliens, they might be comprehensible to us at some level. Now this slide shows, as I mentioned earlier, the fate of all species so far, or at least, you know, obviously there are extant species, but generally the vast majority of species have gone through a growth phase like this, you know, an exponential phase perhaps, and then maybe had possibly quite a long period of stable life on the planet, maybe hundreds of millions of years, but ultimately, maybe because of catastrophes or competition from new types of species, the population crashes and they go extinct. And that's potentially or likely what's going to happen to humans ultimately. And now there's a lot of speculation and philosophical work and I guess scientific work around this possibility that we might be able to engineer ourselves out of this you know, potential future and be able to continue indefinitely as a successful species. There's a nice philosophical argument by a guy in Oxford, Nick Bostrom, who's a Swede, I think, and he works on the self-selection bias, which is it's an argument about a probability argument that says if you're self-sampling yourself, then strange things happen and you can make strange conclusions. So as a human being, saying to myself, I'm a human being, it's far more likely that I'm alive in this part of the graph than down here, and this is just a probability argument because there are very few humans down here, but there are lots of humans up here. So strictly on a probability basis, if I say, here I am, and I look in the mirror, then I'm more likely to have lived in the part of the curve where most humans live. So that's and as we know, you know, with high numbers, etc., probabilities can become certainties. So he's got an argument which says that we are currently near this point, and it may be wrong, but it's a probability argument. There's a good chance that in fact we're close to the end of the life of the human species, and that's purely based on a kind of a philosophical probability argument. Now, the sort of hints, and you may have heard some of this from Mary Robinson earlier, as that this might be coming, would be some of the many examples of severe environmental degradation that are currently happening. And because we're such a successful and such an aggressive species, this is becoming a problem for our survival. So this slide summarizes many examples of the devastating loss of probably non-renewable resources such as forests, wetlands, species going extinct, farmland, etc. And this statistic, Rosario might be able to correct me, but let's just use it as a rough estimate. Maybe a third of people on the planet nowadays suffer from severe water shortages. So the current ideas about future human population growth, this would be unconstrained, a high estimate, a UN estimate, going up to about 14 billion people, you know, within 70 or 80 years. We might stabilize, or it might go down. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen here, but whichever track we follow here is going to have serious implications for the future of humanity. And some very renowned people have got quite a pessimistic view of the human future. So Martin Rees reckons we've got a 50% chance of surviving until the end of this century, and he had a long list of possible disasters that could befall us, including one which I think has probably been ruled out, which was a black hole being created in the collider that's looking for the Higgs boson. So he's got one wrong, hopefully. But nevertheless, there seems to be a great appetite for these doomsday scenarios, because that book got very well reviewed. It was almost as if people were delighted at the prospect. So if human extinction then is a near certainty, as a lot of people seem to think, and it may occur soon, as certain probability arguments and looking around at the environment might suggest, why would anybody propose, or why indeed would we pursue voluntary extinction or antinatalism, as Benatar would paint it? So I just want to define what I mean by antinatalism. He would say that at the moment there's a pronatal bias. It's good to have children. Nobody questions that. But there have been, over time, people who argue the opposite, that for a variety of reasons it's not good to have children. And there's quite a strange group of people, the voluntary human extinction movement, which I have to say I found it hard to take seriously when I read the content, but they think that we're messing up the planet so much that we should get out of the way and become extinct so that other species can have a fair crack at the whip. Now, I'm not really sure why humans would resign in favour of rattlesnakes or shrubs myself, but there you have it. So some of the arguments in favour then of antinatalism, well, there's a version of it which says we don't want to go extinct, we just want to reduce human reproduction in order to stop the depletion of non-renewable resources and the famine, diseases and wars that can come as a result of that. And that to me seems to be a very sensible idea. There is, as I just mentioned, there's this idea that humans are the nastiest species that ever evolved. It may not have occurred to these people that all species are essentially looking to their own survival and the spread of their genes. So in that scenario, there's a moral imperative on humans to go extinct, and to actually go extinct is the way they put it, not to reduce our numbers, which again you'd think might do the job. And then we'll come to Benatar in a few minutes, and his argument is actually quite different. It's to do with harm to individual people rather than any sort of global issue around the state of the planet or other species necessarily. So what do I think about these arguments? Well, human extinction is probably certain, but you know, we've survived a lot already. And in fact, there is evidence from genetics that at points going back maybe 70,000 to 120,000 years, the human population may have undergone bottlenecks, some of which could have been as low as 1,000 humans on the planet. So in Africa, and around the time that humans were coming out of Africa, we potentially could have gone extinct on several occasions. Now these numbers are open to debate. We will see other numbers, maybe 10 or 12,000, but there's no doubt that there were periods in our evolution when we were well past the apes, if you like, when we nearly went extinct. But we're here, and until something nasty, extremely nasty happens, there are lots of things we can do. We can look at technological advances. Voluntary reduction in fertility and female education seems to be an important component of that. Political advances. Perhaps the creation of human-free zones. What if we depopulated large parts of the planet to give the planet a lung? This might happen in any case if there are any more Chernobyls. And then we've Mary Robinson, of course. She'll sort this out, hopefully. So, all of that, all of what I've been talking about so far, according to Benatar, would be of pretty peripheral interest, because his argument really, I think in many ways, is more fundamental from a moral perspective. And so he's come up with a very specific argument against the morality of humans reproducing. And that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk. So who is David Benatar? So he's a proper grown-up philosopher. He's a professor in Cape Town. He's the head of department. As Willie said, I couldn't find a picture of him. So there's even a bizarre website that has a kind of a conspiracy theory about this. But he's a serious philosopher who has worked in moral and social philosophy and ethics. He does seem to have an interest in, we'll say, maybe the farther shores of some human issues, corporal punishment, circumcision, fetal pain, but you know, he's entitled to that. And this is his book, so I'll spend a few minutes just going through some of his arguments. So this is the book's dedication, which I think isn't actually tongue-in-cheek. If you read the book, I think he's quite sincere when he says this. To my parents, even though they brought me into existence, and to my brothers, each of whose existence, although a harm to him, is a great benefit to the rest of us. I quite like it, and in the context of his argument, it's actually quite touching, I think. So his argument is based on the quality of life, and I'm just going to briefly outline one of the philosophical areas that relates to this. He goes through many strands in the book in great detail, and I don't have the knowledge or the background to really pursue that with you. But I think the hedonistic principle is a relatively straightforward one. So this is a school of thought that argues that pleasure is the only intrinsic good, that we should pursue pleasure above pain, and we should try and maximize net pleasure, whatever that means. And this is a long history, so way back in the BCs, Democritus said that the supreme goal of life was contentment and cheerfulness. Epicurus had a kind of a refined and restrained version of this, so he favoured a virtuous and temperate life. It sounds like Willie Rebel, actually, when I read this. And in fact, I think Epicurus was taken up by Christianity. The early church incorporated some of his views into the Christian philosophy. Then we can unite utilitarianism into these arguments, so Bentham and Stuart Mill, that all action should be directed towards achieving the greatest amount of happiness, so the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number, essentially. And then there's a modern philosopher who defines hedonism as an introspective attitude to life based on taking pleasure yourself and pleasuring others, and not just sexually, let me point out, without harming yourself or anyone else. So I think many people will agree that those are absolutely reasonable starting points to think about debating how we should live our lives. Now, founded on those sorts of approaches, Benatar has identified what I would call a key asymmetry, and this is absolutely the core of his argument. And the only reason that I feel confident or presumptuous enough to talk to you about it is that I think that we can all understand this, and this is the foundation of his book. And it's such a simple argument that half of the people I've talked about it have said, "But that's obvious," and the other half have said, "But that's bonkers." So it's that sort of argument, and I think it's the E = mc squared of human existence myself, but I may be wrong, and maybe somebody in the audience can prove me wrong later. So he says, let's think of two scenarios. Scenario A, somebody exists, Mr. X. So in that life, there will be pain, which, let's agree, will be bad, so we'll give that a minus. And there will be pleasure, which is good, so we'll give that a plus. Now there's another scenario, which is that X never exists, so X isn't brought into existence. The parents didn't have that child, for example. What happens to these values in this scenario? Well, one way of looking at it would be to say that the absence of pain, because if you don't exist, you don't suffer, is good, so we'll give that a plus. And many of us, probably without reading Benatar, would say that we have the absence of pleasure, which is bad. And so there's a sort of a balance here. And so, that's a symmetrical graph. But that's not what Benatar says. What Benatar says is, he comes down as far as here, absence of pain is good, but he says absence of pleasure is not bad, and he gives it a 0. Now, this isn't the cork, not bad. Why you buy? Not bad buy. That's good. So, to avoid confusion, I'm going to change his not bad to neutral. Still a 0. So in other words, the absence of pleasure is a neutral. So why is that? Well, his argument, and this is the absolute foundation of his argument. If you're not born, if you don't exist, you don't suffer, and you don't miss the pleasures that you might have had if you did exist, because if you don't exist, you can't be deprived of pleasure. So I realise that I'll have to move on in the talk, but that's something you probably need to chew a bit on yourselves. But that is the foundation of his argument. And having thought about it myself, and I first read this book about a year ago, I think that that's a sound argument. If you don't exist, you won't suffer. If you don't exist, you won't miss the pleasures. And so, without getting too mathematical about it, essentially this scenario comes out on top. Another way of describing it would be to say that by not having people, you reduce the amount of suffering, the total amount of suffering, and you don't deprive anybody of pleasure, because if nobody exists, then who are you depriving? So it's quite a subtle argument in some ways. So that's his argument, and that's probably, we could probably spend, and maybe we will later some time come back to this and have a row about it, but I'll have to move on, and so I'll leave that where it is and just discuss some of the outcomes of that. So coming into existence then, he says, is always a serious harm, because even if you have a perfect life, you still have to die. So that's not good. And nobody has a perfectly happy life. And he makes a lot of arguments in the book that we delude ourselves about our lives, that actually most people, their lives are not as good as they think they are, although I find that slightly puzzling. But I actually don't think he needs to make those arguments, because I think the asymmetry that he's described deals with it, for me anyway. So if you were not born, you would not miss the pleasures that life had to offer. Non-existent individuals cannot have desires or regrets. The children that I never had aren't angry with me. They're not queuing up every morning, "Dad, why did you have only 2 kids? Don't you feel guilty for not having me?" The 65 children I never had aren't queuing up. So those non-existent entities they're not relevant, except in as much as that by not existing, they reduce the amount of suffering that's on the planet. Therefore, he concludes that overall non-existence is beneficial. So his antinatalism then, and this is just a recap of the previous slide, I mean, he would summarize it that creating a new sentient life creates a new center of suffering. So you have a child, you've launched somebody, into the unknown. They are based on everything we know about human history. They will suffer. So that is really the core of his argument. So he doesn't advocate, so people, well, let me just go back 1 minute. So many people then will say, well, surely if you exist, there's a balance. You know, let's add, subtract the pain from the pleasure. But if you have a net, positive sign to that equation, then surely life is worth living. And Benatar says, no, that's not the way it works. It's simply that if you exist, you will suffer. If you don't exist, you won't suffer, and you won't miss the pleasures that you might have had. He doesn't advocate discontinuation of existing lives for a variety of reasons, not least because to do that would be illegal. There are other moral arguments around terminating continuing lives, and also it would cause suffering in, amongst your relatives, your friends, etc. So that's not really something that he proposes. So murder is still murder. Death of individuals causes suffering to friends and relatives. He also acknowledges that our Darwinian drives towards optimism and personal survival and reproduction are very powerful. So it's very hard to read an argument or come to a talk like this and then go out and decide to end it all. I wouldn't expect that, and neither does he. So he hasn't committed suicide. Why should the rest of us? He argues that at the later stages of extinction, that program, if it was put in place, would cause extensive suffering. So there's a kind of a basic problem about going extinct, because the last people on the planet would no doubt suffer as that was going on. But what if we had a machine where we could press a button and get instantaneous worldwide extinction? So 1 minute everybody's jumping around, and the next everybody's gone. So no suffering, no anxieties, and no more suffering on the planet because no more sentient beings. So I'll come back to that. I have a wacky theory of my own about that. So is this a philosophical game or a joke? So what does Benatar say? I should emphasize that I'm entirely serious in my arguments and I believe the conclusions. And I guess we have to take him at his word. He's written a nice book about it. This is a fan that I found online. I've heard Benatar talk, so there's a YouTube interview of him, and he's surprisingly sunny. I suppose I expected more dark and dour tone from someone who believes it's a mistake to create new people. So there's some slightly offensive stuff. He must be depressed. I wonder what is his life like. And I think that's a bit insulting to a serious philosopher. So what do other philosophers say? Maybe there are some in the room. I can find very little actually online or in the literature. There are a few fairly feeble attempts at rebuttal, which I think he has actually dealt with in the book. So I'm not at all convinced that philosophers, either they're not taking it seriously, or they can't rebut it. And I wasn't able to find really a substantive rebuttal of his argument. Let's cast the net more widely. What does Seamus Heaney say about it? We've had Mary Robinson. What does Seamus say? Well, in his latest book, he has a nice poem, Had I Not Been Awake. Had I not been awake, I would have missed it. And that's really the way a lot of people feel about existence. It's great to be alive, even though we suffer, and it's always a challenge. Who would have missed it? Who would have missed the ride? But Benatar would, I think, he'd nullify that argument. Other poets aren't so positive. So Philip Larkin, Get Out as Early as You Can and Don't Have Any Kids Yourself, his famous poem. I'd better not say the first line, it's a little bit crude for seeing as we're recording, but there are antinatalists out there amongst the poetry community. What do scientists say? Well, Richard Dawkins hasn't addressed Benatar, but he has a general argument going right back to his selfish gene in 1976, where he says that we're the only species on the planet by virtue of our amazing brain development, our complex culture and our capacities for self-reflection, who can actually call time on the Darwinian rat race. We can step outside of that process and tamper with it ourselves and actually change the direction of it. And I think in that sense he's probably in line with Benatar, who actually wants to terminate it entirely. Maybe that's not what Dawkins would have in mind. Now there is a possible solution if we don't want to go extinct, and Benatar himself acknowledges that, you know, his argument is not going to make the blindest bit of difference to reproductive practices, for example. Does it provide an impetus, perhaps, to improving the quality of human life? And so I just put this up as it's another ology or ism, but I think it's quite an intriguing one. So there's a field called transhumanism, where people are actively pursuing and thinking about how we can engineer humans into essentially a different species, and maybe a technology-based species, with upload our neurons or the contents of our brains onto the internet and float around like that for eternity. And I'd like to direct you to Nick Bostrom's homepage. So he's got some intriguing arguments about human extinction and the probabilities of that. And I don't have time to go into that. But even transhumanism has got quite a few critics. So there's a whole list here of arguments against transhumanism. But I wonder whether many of these critics just lack imagination. They can't envisage something as dramatic as humans, you know, surviving for eternity, engineering themselves into a position where you can have that perfect life. You know, we didn't have antibiotics 100 years ago. It would, you know, if you went back to the Middle Ages and you could cure some of those infectious diseases, it would look like transhumanism. So we shouldn't put too many boundaries on our imagination, I think. Now, the last few slides, I want to just, this is a bit of nonsense I've tagged on to the end of Benatar, so please don't hold him accountable. If we think about advanced alien races, so Mr. Spock here, who was pretty high up on the scale when it came to morals and ethics and logic, what would they make of Benatar? Well, you might think that if they were convinced by him, that they would go extinct voluntarily. Now, if they have Darwinian, I'm assuming that they've outreached their Darwinian impulses, and they're you know, purely logical and in some sense ethical. So maybe there are no advanced aliens out there, because once they reach a certain level of stage of intellectual development, they decide that they agree with Benatar and they disappear. Or, perhaps more worryingly, maybe they make that ultimate sacrifice by foregoing their own extinction, and they help other species to go extinct. So sterilizing whole planets in an instant might be feasible for aliens. You could think of I'll show you an example of a Death Star in the next slide or two. So I feel that we should be nervous about meeting nice aliens, the nasty ones that just want to take our dilithium crystals for their warp engine drives. We can deal with that. But if we meet these highly moral, ethical aliens, they might actually be going around the galaxy trying to do various planets where they're suffering a favor by wiping everybody out instantaneously. So an alien Death Star isn't just science fiction. We have the technology. So this is from the Daily Telegraph in just a week ago. A black hole is blasting an immense jet of energy into a neighboring galaxy, and it's essentially frying whole solar systems. So in fact, the engine is out there if we want to instantaneously destroy life on entire planets. If the aliens got a hold of that, we might be in trouble. So conclusions. I'm not aware of successful counter-arguments to Benatar, but I'm open to education on that. I do not believe his conclusions are implementable, neither does Benatar, incidentally. His argument has intellectual value. You know, we're interested in the size of the universe, the age of the universe, things that don't necessarily produce the next cancer drug. So I think that it's potentially a profound argument about human existence. And again, I might be ultimately corrected on that point, not being a professional philosopher. But to me, it does seem to have a simple logic to it. And I think his views might provide an argument for responsible reproduction. So get rid of this idea that we can all have sex and damn the consequences. But of course there are dangers with that, because you can very easily drift into a sort of totalitarian scenario where we're limiting people's personal reproduction, and there have been many histories of that sort of thing which haven't really worked out very well. and beware nice aliens. So I just want to finish with this slide, so I'm warming to this idea. And Willie, are you looking very carefully? So thank you very much.